May 13th, 1943, Camp Hearne, Texas. 371,683 German prisoners of war held across 700 camps in 47 American states. Baseball diamonds carved from prairie dirt, bleachers hammered together by enemy hands. The stakes were deeper than any game. This was the moment when soldiers of the Third Reich discovered America wasn't the broken, decadent nation their propaganda had promised. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Brenner crouched behind the third baseline at Camp Hearne, watching something that defied every lesson drummed into his head since 1933. American guards and German prisoners sat side by side in makeshift bleachers, sharing cigarettes and cheering for the same batter. The Oklahoma sun beat down on 4,800 German prisoners, all staring at 9 men in dusty uniforms chasing a small white ball across a diamond-shaped field. "This makes no sense," muttered Gefreiter Hans Mueller, adjusting his blue-gray prison uniform. "Why do they stop running when they catch the ball?" Brenner had been asking himself the same question for 3 weeks. Baseball, the American game that seemed to capture everything about the strange country, complex rules that somehow made perfect sense, moments of explosive action followed by careful strategy, and an obsession with statistics that reminded him of German engineering precision turned toward play. The batter cracked a line drive toward left field. The crowd erupted. German voices mixed with American shouts, creating a sound that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months ago when Brenner was dodging British artillery in Tunisia. Now he was gaining weight on American rations, learning a sport that didn't exist in the fatherland, and slowly understanding that everything he'd been told about America was a lie. Camp Hearne sprawled across East Texas like a small city, holding more German prisoners than any other facility in the state. Texas housed roughly 10% of all Axis prisoners of war in America, approximately 45,000 men who had crossed an ocean to fight for Hitler and instead found themselves learning to love a game played with a stick and a ball. The numbers told a story that party officials back in Berlin would never believe. 425,871 prisoners of war held in the United States at peak capacity. 371,683 of them German. 700 total camps scattered from coast to coast, with only Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont lacking facilities. Each enlisted prisoner guaranteed 40 square feet of living space, more room than many had enjoyed in their childhood homes in bombed-out German cities. Oberstfreiter Friedrich Kellner had arrived at Camp Brady in January 1944, expecting the harsh treatment promised by Nazi propaganda about American prison camps. Instead, he found an outdoor bowling alley built by previous prisoners, 4 regulation handball courts, a track, 12 regulation volleyball courts, and most surprisingly, a baseball diamond with real bases and a backstop that looked like it belonged at a university. "The Americans are trying to corrupt us with comfort," declared Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich during morning formation at Camp Brady. "This baseball is a distraction from our duty as German soldiers." But Kellner noticed that even Dietrich had started attending the evening games, sitting in the back row of the bleachers and taking careful notes in a small journal. Later, Kellner would learn that Dietrich was documenting every aspect of American prison administration not for intelligence purposes, but because he couldn't believe a nation could afford to treat its enemies so well. The transformation began with food. When Kellner was captured, he weighed 58 kilograms. After 2 years as an American prisoner of war, he weighed 84 kilograms. His eyes had disappeared into a round face that his mother wouldn't recognize. The same story repeated itself across 700 camps, German soldiers arriving as scarecrows and leaving as well-fed men who struggled to fit into their old uniforms. "We ate better as prisoners than we did as soldiers," admitted Feldwebel Gustav Weber decades later, sitting in his comfortable home in Georgetown, Maine, where he had settled after the war. Weber had been captured at the Kasserine Pass in February 1943 and spent 32 months at Camp Robinson in Arkansas, widely regarded as a model facility. At Camp Robinson, 23,000 German and Italian prisoners rotated through a complex that resembled a small college more than a prison. The facility boasted libraries with up to 15,000 volumes, theaters that seated 200 people, and sports equipment distributed by the YMCA and International Red Cross. 1,754,254 pieces of sports equipment had been shipped from the United States to Europe for prisoner camps: basketballs, volleyballs, ping-pong paddles, and most importantly for camps in America, baseball equipment. Weber's first exposure to baseball came on a humid Arkansas afternoon in June 1943. The camp's American Guards had organized a demonstration game between two teams of prisoners, with a civilian coach brought in from Little Rock to explain the rules. Weber watched from the fence line as grown men took turns hitting a ball with a wooden stick, then ran in a circle. "In Germany, we would call this children's play," he whispered to his barracks mate, Gefreiter Otto Zimmermann. By the end of the summer, Weber was playing third base for the Camp Robinson Ravens, a team that competed against other prisoner teams and occasionally against local civilian clubs. The Ravens had a winning record that season, 16 victories and 11 defeats, statistics carefully tracked in a ledger that Weber kept until his death in 2018. The complexity of baseball statistics appealed to German minds trained in precision. Batting averages calculated to 3 decimal places. Earned run averages that required mathematical formulas. Win-loss records, stolen base percentages, fielding percentages, every aspect of the game reduced to numbers that could be analyzed, compared, and improved upon. Lieutenant Heinrich Braun discovered this statistical obsession during his time at Camp Concordia in Kansas, where prisoners had created an elaborate baseball league with 8 teams, complete playoff series, and record books that tracked individual and team statistics across multiple seasons. Braun had been a mathematics instructor at a gymnasium in Munich before the war, and he found himself fascinated by the American approach to quantifying sports performance. "Baseball is mathematics in motion," Braun wrote in a letter to his wife in Munich, one of thousands of letters that passed through camp censors every week. "Every at-bat becomes a probability calculation. Every strategic decision can be reduced to statistical analysis. It is the most German thing about America." The statistical sophistication extended beyond individual performance. Prison camps tracked attendance figures for games. Camp Brady regularly drew crowds of 2,000 for important matches. Equipment inventories were maintained with Germanic thoroughness. The Camp Hearne baseball program utilized 48 official baseballs, 16 wooden bats, 36 gloves, and 8 sets of uniforms sewn by prisoners working in the camp tailor shop. Equipment maintenance became a source of pride and innovation. German engineering skills, developed through years of military training, found new expression in maintaining baseball fields. Prisoners at Camp Como in Mississippi built an irrigation system for their diamond using salvaged pipes and a pump mechanism designed by former Mercedes-Benz engineer Oberstfreiter Klaus Zimmermann. The system could water the entire infield in 22 minutes, faster than most civilian facilities. At Camp Algona in Iowa, prisoners constructed a grandstand that seated 400 spectators, complete with a press box where former newspaper editor Feldwebel Rudolf Lang provided play-by-play commentary in both German and English. The structure was built to engineering specifications that exceeded local building codes, with stress calculations performed by former Luftwaffe technicians who applied the same precision they had once used for aircraft construction. The cultural shock went beyond the game itself. American Guards encouraged fraternization that would have been unthinkable under German military discipline. At Camp Mahia in Texas, guards and prisoners formed mixed teams for weekly games against civilian clubs from surrounding towns. The sight of American soldiers and German prisoners celebrating together after scoring runs created cognitive dissonance that many prisoners struggled to process. "Everything we were taught about American decadence was backwards," admitted Hauptfeldwebel Werner Schneider in a 1980s interview for a Texas Historical Society. Americans were disciplined, organized, and physically fit. Their soldiers were well-equipped and well-trained. Their factories produced equipment in quantities we couldn't match. And they treated their enemies better than we treated our own allies. Schneider had commanded a company of engineers in the Afrika Korps before his capture at El Alamein in October 1942. His first glimpse of America came through the portholes of a Liberty ship during a 14-day crossing from North Africa to Norfolk, Virginia. The comfort of the Pullman cars that carried prisoners to their camps amazed soldiers accustomed to cattle cars and forced marches. The train compartments had upholstered seats, clean windows, and dining cars where we were served hot meals, Schneider recalled. American military police treated us with more respect than SS officers had shown toward Wehrmacht troops. We began to suspect that our understanding of this country was fundamentally wrong. The revelation deepened at Camp Swift near Bastrop, Texas, where Schneider spent 28 months learning American culture through baseball. The camp held 3,400 German prisoners on a facility originally designed for civilian Conservation Corps workers. Existing buildings had been modified with German labor, but the additions followed American building codes that emphasized worker safety and comfort over speed of construction. Schneider's engineering background made him valuable for camp construction projects, but his real education came during evening baseball games when off-duty American guards would explain strategy and statistics. Technical Sergeant James Patterson, a machinist from Detroit, spent hours teaching Schneider the complexities of defensive positioning, pitch selection, and situational hitting. Sergeant Patterson treated me like a student, not an enemy, Schneider remembered. He would draw diagrams in the dirt, explaining why the shortstop moved 2 steps towards second base with a left-handed batter at the plate. His patience and detailed instruction reminded me of the best instructors at engineering school. The educational aspect of baseball camps extended far beyond sports. The War Department had authorized extension courses through local universities for prisoners who wanted education not available inside their camps. By war's end, thousands of German prisoners had earned college credits in subjects ranging from agriculture to advanced mathematics. Many of these educational programs used baseball statistics as practical examples for teaching American business methods and statistical analysis. At Sam Houston State Teachers College, Professor Dr. Margaret Willis developed a curriculum that used baseball record-keeping to teach American accounting practices to German prisoners from nearby Camp Huntsville. 23 prisoners completed the full course, learning double-entry bookkeeping, statistical analysis, and business correspondence through the lens of sports administration. Baseball provided a non-threatening introduction to American business culture, Dr. Willis explained in a 1946 academic paper. Prisoners who might have resented direct instruction in American methods welcomed the same information when presented through sports examples. The psychological transformation accelerated as prisoners discovered that baseball success required the same qualities valued in German military culture: discipline, teamwork, strategic thinking, and precision execution. But unlike military operations, baseball rewarded these qualities through play rather than destruction. Oberleutnant Martin Richter experienced this transformation at Camp Clark in Missouri, where he managed a prisoner team that competed against local high school and college teams. Richter had been a promising young officer in the Wehrmacht, identified for rapid promotion before his capture during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Managing a baseball team required the same skills as commanding a military unit, Richter observed in a memoir published in 1978. You needed to understand each player's strengths and limitations, develop strategies for different situations, and maintain morale during difficult periods. But instead of planning attacks, we planned offensive innings. Instead of casualties, we had strikeouts. Richter's team, the Camp Clark Cardinals, finished the 1945 season with 24 wins and 12 losses, good enough to reach the championship game of the Missouri Prison Camp League, a formal organization that included teams from 8 facilities across the state. The championship game drew 3,800 spectators to a high school stadium in Jefferson City, including the governor of Missouri and several state legislators. The political implications of these public games troubled some prisoners but delighted others. Hauptmann George Weber, a former Nazi Party member captured at Normandy, initially refused to participate in baseball activities that he considered American propaganda. But Weber's isolation became complete when even hardcore party loyalists in his compound began attending games and discussing batting averages over meals. The baseball corrupted more German soldiers than American propaganda ever could, Weber complained in letters intercepted by camp censors. Men who had sworn oaths to the Führer were learning American songs and cheering for American teams. The game was a weapon more dangerous than any bomb. Weber's analysis contained more truth than he realized. Baseball served American strategic interests by demonstrating the nation's prosperity, organizational capacity, and cultural confidence. Prisoners who returned to Germany carried stories about American abundance that contradicted Nazi propaganda about enemy weakness and desperation. The abundance manifested itself in countless small details that accumulated into overwhelming evidence of American industrial capacity. Each baseball represented sophisticated manufacturing leather covers stitched with mathematical precision, cork centers wound with exactly 237 yards of yarn, finished with a careful coating that balanced durability with playability. American camps discarded worn baseballs that would have been treasured in Germany, where rubber and leather were precious wartime commodities. Bat production followed similar patterns of excess. The Hill Eric and Bradsby Company in Louisville, Kentucky, manufactured professional quality wooden bats for prison camp use, stamping each handle with the famous Louisville Slugger trademark. Prisoners received better equipment than most amateur teams in Germany had ever possessed, demonstrating American capacity to produce luxury items even during wartime rationing. The psychological impact deepened when prisoners learned about American production statistics. Boeing aircraft factories in Seattle produced one B-17 Flying Fortress bomber every 90 minutes during peak production periods. Ford's Willow Run plant completed one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. General Motors converted automobile production lines to manufacture tanks, aircraft engines, and artillery pieces without disrupting civilian truck production. "We thought American industry was weak because it focused on consumer goods," admitted Feldwebel Hans Mueller in a 1992 interview. But consumer goods production had taught American factories to achieve levels of precision, speed, and quality that German industry couldn't match. Their ability to manufacture perfect baseballs and baseball bats demonstrated the same industrial sophistication that produced superior aircraft and tanks. Mueller had worked in a Krupp steel plant before his military service, giving him expertise to evaluate American manufacturing methods. During his 24 months at Camp Hood in Texas, he was assigned to a machine shop that maintained camp equipment and occasionally produced parts for local civilian contractors. American machine tools were more precise than German equivalents, Mueller observed. Their steel was higher quality, their measurements more accurate, their safety procedures more comprehensive. German propaganda claimed that Americans were undisciplined and sloppy, but their manufacturing reflected a culture of precision that surpassed German standards. The machine shop at Camp Hood employed 47 German prisoners under supervision of 3 American technical sergeants. The facility maintained all camp equipment, from kitchen appliances to vehicle engines, while also producing specialized parts for local oil drilling operations. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day for skilled labor, wages that could be spent at the camp canteen for cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and even beer. The economic freedom shocked prisoners accustomed to centralized distribution systems. Camp canteens operated like small businesses, stocking merchandise based on prisoner preferences and purchasing power. Popular items disappeared quickly, forcing prisoners to save money and plan purchases. Unpopular items went on sale, introducing German soldiers to American-style consumer choice. Oberstfreiter Kurt Wagner discovered this consumer culture through baseball card trading at Camp Forest in Tennessee. American guards had introduced prisoners to baseball cards, small pieces of cardboard with player photographs and statistics that could be collected, traded, and organized into complete sets. Wagner became obsessed with completing a 1944 set of Gaudy baseball cards, learning player names, team affiliations, and statistical achievements in the process. "Baseball cards taught me more about American culture than any propaganda lecture could have accomplished," Wagner reflected in a letter to his son written in 1973. Each card represented an individual success story, a young man who had developed his talents through practice and competition, achieved recognition through merit, and earned financial rewards based on performance. It was capitalism reduced to its essential elements. Wagner traded cigarettes, candy, and craft items for specific cards needed to complete his collection. The process required negotiation skills, market analysis, and strategic planning. He learned to identify which guards collected cards themselves and might be willing to trade duplicates. He studied prisoner preferences to determine which players were most popular and therefore most valuable in trades. The card collection survived Wagner's repatriation to Germany in 1946, hidden in his personal belongings during the chaos of liberation. Decades later, the collection provided a tangible connection to his American experience, and served as educational material for his children and grandchildren learning about democracy and market economics. Similar collections accumulated across 700 camps as German prisoners embraced American popular culture through sports memorabilia. Programs from Major League games, autographed baseballs from visiting players, and photographs of prison camp teams created archives that documented the transformation of enemy soldiers into temporary Americans. At Camp Como in Mississippi, the camp newspaper Die Lagerpost devoted 2 pages each week to baseball coverage, including game summaries, player profiles, and statistical analyses. Editor Lieutenant Wilhelm Brenner, a former journalist from Hamburg, applied professional standards to sports reporting that rivaled coverage in civilian newspapers. Baseball writing taught me American journalism techniques, Brenner explained in a 1955 letter to the Columbia Journalism Review. American sports writing emphasized factual reporting, statistical accuracy, and objective analysis, rather than ideological interpretation. The discipline of describing baseball games without political commentary prepared me for post-war work as a correspondent covering American business methods. Die Lagerpost baseball coverage included detailed box scores that tracked individual player performance across multiple games and seasons. Statistical leaders were published monthly, creating friendly competition among prisoners who understood that baseball success could translate into social status within the camp community. The newspaper also reported on Major League Baseball, with American guards providing wire service reports and game summaries from civilian newspapers. German prisoners followed the pennant races of 1944 and 1945 with enthusiasm that matched their former interest in military campaigns. We studied American League standings with the same intensity we had once applied to Wehrmacht battle reports, remembered Unteroffizier Friedrich Lang, a regular reader of Die Lagerpost during his internment at Camp Como. The Detroit Tigers' pursuit of the 1944 pennant provided daily drama that distracted us from the grimmer reality of Germany's collapsing military position. Lang had been captured during the Normandy campaign and transported to America aboard a Liberty ship in August 1944. His first exposure to baseball came during the voyage, when American crew members organized daily games on the ship's deck using a rubber ball and improvised equipment. The Americans were trying to maintain our morale during a difficult journey, Lang recalled. They understood that bored, depressed prisoners could become dangerous, so they introduced us to activities that provided entertainment without requiring sophisticated equipment or extensive space. The shipboard games used simplified rules that emphasized fun over competition. Prisoners and crew members formed mixed teams, creating an atmosphere of cooperation that violated every expectation about prisoner-guard relationships. American sailors taught German soldiers basic English through baseball terminology, strike, ball, safe, out, establishing a common vocabulary that facilitated communication in American camps. Language learning accelerated once prisoners reached permanent facilities where structured education programs supplemented informal baseball instruction. The War Department encouraged English language education as preparation for post-war repatriation, but many prisoners pursued advanced studies that prepared them for potential immigration to America. Dr. Ernst Zimmermann, a former university professor captured during the Battle of the Bulge, taught English classes at Camp Gordon in Georgia using baseball instruction as a teaching method. Students learned vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation through sports activities that made language acquisition feel like recreation rather than education. Baseball provided context for abstract grammar lessons, Dr. Zimmermann explained in a report to camp administrators. Instead of memorizing verb conjugations from textbooks, students learned past tense by describing completed plays. The batter swung and missed. Present perfect tense came from ongoing game situations. The runner has stolen second base. Future tense emerged from strategic planning. The pitcher will throw a curveball. English proficiency opened opportunities for prisoners who demonstrated exceptional language skills and cultural adaptation. Camp administrators selected bilingual prisoners for positions as interpreters, translators, and liaisons with local civilian communities. These positions provided additional privileges, including liberty passes for supervised visits to nearby towns. Oberstfreiter Hans Wecker utilized such privileges during his internment at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, where he worked as an interpreter for prisoner work details assigned to local farmers. Wecker's excellent English and mechanical skills made him valuable for agricultural projects that required communication between German prisoners and American civilians. "The farmers treated us like hired hands rather than enemy prisoners," Wecker remembered in a 1998 interview. "We ate meals at their tables, received Christmas gifts for their families, and participated in community activities including baseball games between prison teams and civilian clubs." Wecker's experience reflected broader patterns of German integration into American rural communities where labor shortages created opportunities for prisoner employment. Approximately 12,000 German prisoners worked on Nebraska farms during peak agricultural seasons, earning wages that could be sent home to support families in war-torn Germany. The economic relationships challenged preconceptions on both sides. American farmers discovered that German prisoners were disciplined, skilled workers who required minimal supervision and produced high-quality results. German prisoners learned that American agriculture operated on an industrial scale that dwarfed European farming methods. American farms were factories that produced food rather than small family operations, observed Feldwebel Gustav Weber, who worked on a corn and cattle operation near Grand Island, Nebraska. "The machinery was more sophisticated, the livestock healthier, and the crop yields higher than anything we had seen in Germany. It was clear that American prosperity was based on technological superiority rather than resource exploitation." Weber's agricultural education extended beyond technical methods to include American business practices, labor relations, and community organization. The farmer who employed his work detail, Robert Luetjens, treated the German prisoners as temporary members of his extended family, providing holiday meals, recreational activities, and informal English instruction. "Mr. Luetjens and his family showed us kindness that we had not experienced from our own officers," Weber recalled. "His children played games with us and brought us candy and gum. His wife prepared special meals for German holidays. Their generosity demonstrated Christian values that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American materialism and selfishness." The Luetjens family maintained correspondence with German prisoners after their repatriation, sending food packages and clothing to help with post-war recovery. Similar relationships developed across rural America where prisoner labor programs created personal connections that outlasted the war. Mel Luetjens, Robert's son, remembered the German prisoners as hardworking men who taught him card games and helped with farm chores. "They were the enemy, of course," Luetjens reflected in a 2013 interview. "But at that age, you don't know enough to be afraid. They were just friendly young men who happened to be wearing different uniforms." The rural prisoner programs created positive propaganda effects that extended far beyond individual relationships. German prisoners wrote letters home describing American abundance, technological sophistication, and civilian prosperity that contradicted Nazi claims about enemy weakness and desperation. Censorship records from Camp Algona in Iowa documented this information warfare in prisoner correspondence. Between January and December 1944, German prisoners mailed 43,700 letters to addresses in Germany and German-occupied territories. Camp censors reported that 91% of letters contained positive descriptions of American food, housing, recreational opportunities, and civilian prosperity. "Prisoner letters constituted the most effective propaganda weapon in our arsenal," admitted Colonel James Patterson, commander of the Army's Prisoner of War Division, in a confidential memo to the War Department. German families receiving detailed accounts of American abundance from trusted relatives were more likely to question Nazi propaganda than civilians exposed to official Allied information broadcasts. The letter-writing program received official encouragement from camp administrators who understood its strategic value. Prisoners were provided with free stationery, postage, and translation services for correspondents who lacked English proficiency. Camp libraries stocked German-language newspapers and magazines to help prisoners maintain connections with homeland events while developing appreciation for American freedoms. Lieutenant Heinrich Braun utilized library resources at Camp Concordia in Kansas to research American industrial statistics that he incorporated into letters to his wife in Munich. Braun had been an economics instructor before the war, and his correspondence provided detailed analyses of American production capacity, agricultural output, and civilian living standards. American steel production exceeds German levels by a factor of 4 to 1, Braun wrote in a letter dated November 15th, 1944, "Automobile ownership is 30 times higher than in Germany. Food consumption per capita suggests a population that has never experienced serious rationing. These statistics indicate an industrial base that can sustain military operations indefinitely while maintaining civilian prosperity." Braun's letters reached Munich through international Red Cross channels, providing German civilians with information about American capabilities that contradicted optimistic propaganda from Joseph Goebbels' ministry. Similar letters from thousands of prisoners created an informal intelligence network that undermined Nazi claims about Allied weaknesses. The information flow included technical details about American military equipment that impressed German professionals with backgrounds in engineering and manufacturing. Prisoners assigned to camp maintenance duties worked with American tools, vehicles, and machinery that demonstrated technological advantages over German equivalents. At Camp Hood in Texas, Oberstfreiter Kurt Wagner worked in a motor pool that maintained a fleet of American military vehicles including jeeps, trucks, and bulldozers. Wagner had been a mechanic in a panzer regiment before his capture, giving him expertise to evaluate American automotive technology. American vehicles were engineered for reliability rather than performance, Wagner observed in a technical report that he prepared for camp administrators. German tanks were faster and more heavily armored, but American tanks were easier to maintain, cheaper to produce, and available in greater quantities. American industrial philosophy prioritized practical effectiveness over technical sophistication. Wagner's analysis reflected broader German recognition that American success resulted from organizational and industrial advantages rather than individual weapon superiority. The Sherman tank was inferior to the Tiger tank in direct combat, but American factories produced 49,400 Shermans compared to 1,347 Tigers. Americans won through numbers rather than quality, admitted Hauptmann George Weber in a post-war interview. But achieving superior numbers required industrial organization, resource management, and production techniques that surpassed German capabilities. Their victory was based on systematic advantages rather than accidental circumstances. Weber's evolving perspective reflected broader German acknowledgement that American success represented cultural and institutional strengths rather than temporary military luck. The baseball programs that seemed frivolous to German officers actually demonstrated American capacity to organize, manage, and sustain complex activities while maintaining high standards of performance. The organizational sophistication appeared in every aspect of camp management, from meal planning that accommodated 4,800 prisoners at Camp Hearne to recreational programs that provided structured activities for 700 camps simultaneously. American administrators coordinated supply chains, personnel assignments, and logistical support with precision that impressed German military professionals. American prison administration was more efficient than German military headquarters, observed Oberst Friedrich Kellner, the highest-ranking German officer at Camp Clinton in Mississippi. They managed 425,000 prisoners across 47 states with fewer administrative personnel than we used to coordinate a single Army corps. Kellner's assessment was based on direct observation of American methods during his 28 months at Camp Clinton, where German generals and admirals were housed in individual bungalows with gardens, libraries, and recreational facilities that exceeded accommodations provided to Wehrmacht officers in Germany. The contrast was particularly stark for junior officers like Lieutenant Martin Richter, who discovered that American prison quarters were superior to his pre-war accommodations as a Wehrmacht officer. Each prisoner received 40 square feet of personal space, compared to 32 square feet for German military barracks. American facilities included central heating, electric lighting, and indoor plumbing that were luxuries in German military installations. "We lived better as American prisoners than we had as German soldiers," Richter admitted in a memoir published in 1978. "Our barracks were heated during winter, our meals were regular and nutritious, and our recreational opportunities included activities that would have been impossible in German military culture." The recreational program included not only baseball but also theatrical productions, musical concerts, educational courses, and craft workshops that provided creative outlets for prisoners with artistic talents. Camp theaters produced elaborate performances with costumes, scenery, and musical accompaniment that rivaled professional productions in small German cities. At Camp Mohaya in Texas, The theater troupe performed a complete season of German classical dramas including works by Goethe, Schiller, and Shakespeare translated into German. The camp's theater seated 200 spectators and featured an orchestra pit, tiered stadium seating, and professional lighting equipment installed by prisoners with theatrical backgrounds. Hauptfeldwebel Werner Schneider, who managed the Camp Mejia theater program, had worked as a stage designer in Berlin before the war. His American captivity provided opportunities to experiment with theatrical techniques and technologies that were unavailable in wartime Germany. American prison camps had better theatrical facilities than most German provincial theaters. Schneider recalled in an interview with Theater Arts magazine published in 1952, "We had access to electric lighting, sound equipment, and construction materials that allowed us to create productions that exceeded our previous professional work." The theater program served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. Camp administrators encouraged cultural activities that maintained prisoner morale while demonstrating American respect for German intellectual achievements. The performances also provided English language education for prisoners and cultural exchange opportunities for American guards and local civilians. Local newspaper coverage of prison camp theatrical productions helped normalize the German presence in American communities while showcasing prisoner talents and cultural sophistication. The Mejia Daily News published reviews of camp performances that treated German actors as legitimate artists rather than enemy prisoners. Last night's performance of Faust at the prisoner of war camp demonstrated artistic excellence that would be welcome on any American stage, wrote drama critic Margaret Hawkins in a review published March 22, 1945. The lead actor's portrayal of Mephistopheles combined classical German theatrical traditions with emotional intensity that transcended language barriers. Such coverage reflected broader American efforts to maintain public support for prisoner programs that provided generous treatment to enemy soldiers. Camp administrators understood that civilian cooperation was essential for prisoner work programs, recreational activities, and community integration that served strategic American interests. The community integration accelerated as American civilians discovered that German prisoners were disciplined, skilled workers who posed minimal security risks. Less than 1% of German prisoners attempted escape from American camps, and most escapees were recaptured within 48 hours without incident. The low escape rate reflected prisoner satisfaction with American treatment as much as effective security measures. Many German prisoners were reluctant to leave camps that provided regular meals, comfortable housing, educational opportunities, and recreational activities that exceeded their pre-war living standards. "I had no desire to escape from Camp Algona," admitted Feldwebel Rudolf Lang in a 1985 interview. "The camp provided the first stable living situation I had experienced since leaving my parents' home in 1938. American treatment was so generous that escape would have been ungrateful as well as pointless." Lang's perspective reflected common prisoner attitudes documented in camp morale reports prepared by American intelligence officers. Monthly surveys indicated that prisoner satisfaction increased steadily throughout the war, reaching 93% positive responses by May 1945. The satisfaction levels correlated with prisoner adaptation to American culture through sports, education, and work programs that provided meaningful activities while building practical skills. Baseball instruction contributed to this adaptation by introducing German prisoners to American concepts of fair play, team cooperation, and individual achievement within group contexts. Dr. Ernst Zimmermann observed this cultural transmission during his work as an English instructor at Camp Gordon in Georgia, where baseball activities reinforced language lessons and social integration. Students who mastered baseball terminology and rules demonstrated broader success in English comprehension and American cultural adaptation. Baseball served as a gateway to American culture, Dr. Zimmermann explained in a report to the War Department's Education Division. Students who understood baseball strategy could comprehend American business methods, political processes, and social relationships that were based on similar principles of competition, cooperation, and rule-based interaction. The cultural education extended beyond individual prisoner development to include preparation for post-war reconstruction of Germany under American influence. Camp administrators understood that repatriated prisoners would serve as informal ambassadors for American values and methods in occupied Germany. Colonel Patterson's confidential memos to the War Department emphasized this strategic dimension of prisoner programs. German prisoners who returned to their homeland with positive impressions of American democracy, capitalism, and cultural values will constitute our most effective weapon in the ideological struggle for post-war European influence, Patterson wrote in a report dated January 10, 1945. The ideological struggle intensified as the war approached its conclusion and American officials began planning for German occupation and reconstruction. Prisoner camps served as laboratories for testing methods of democratic education, economic retraining, and cultural reorientation that would be applied to the entire German population. Baseball programs provided practical experience in democratic decision-making through team selection, rule interpretation, and conflict resolution that demonstrated alternatives to authoritarian leadership. German prisoners learned to elect team captains, negotiate disputes, and organize activities through consensus rather than command authority. These democratic experiences challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership and authority that had been reinforced through years of Nazi education and military training. Many German prisoners discovered that democratic methods could achieve better results than authoritarian approaches in situations requiring cooperation and voluntary compliance. Oberstreiter Hans Wecker experienced this revelation during his service as team captain for the Fort Robinson Eagles, a prisoner baseball team that competed against civilian clubs throughout northwestern Nebraska. Wecker's leadership style evolved from military command methods to democratic consultation as he learned that volunteer players responded better to collaborative rather than authoritarian approaches. Military discipline was counterproductive in baseball because success required creativity, initiative, and emotional commitment that could not be commanded, Wecker reflected in a letter to his son written in 1973. Democratic leadership methods that encouraged player input and shared decision-making produced better results than traditional German approaches based on unquestioning obedience. Wecker's leadership evolution paralleled broader prisoner adaptation to American social and political values that emphasized individual rights, majority rule, and minority protection. Camp governance systems provided practical education in democratic procedures through prisoner councils, grievance committees, and electoral processes that gave German soldiers experience with constitutional government. The prisoner councils at Camp Robinson handled routine administrative matters including recreational scheduling, work assignments, and disciplinary issues under American supervision. German prisoners learned to write constitutions, conduct elections, and manage budgets through democratic procedures that prepared them for participation in post-war German reconstruction. Council member Lieutenant Heinrich Braun discovered that democratic governance required skills in negotiation, compromise, and consensus building that differed fundamentally from military command methods. Democratic leadership was more difficult than military authority because it required persuasion rather than compulsion, Braun observed in his memoir published in 1967. The governance experience prepared prisoners for active citizenship in democratic Germany under American occupation. Camp administrators documented prisoner political development through reports that tracked attitudes toward democracy, capitalism, and individual rights throughout the internment period. Monthly attitude surveys indicated steady movement toward democratic values among German prisoners exposed to American political and social methods. By April 1945, 87% of prisoners expressed preference for democratic government over authoritarian alternatives when asked about post-war German political arrangements. The attitude changes reflected practical education rather than propaganda indoctrination. German prisoners observed democratic methods in action through camp governance, recreational activities, and work programs that demonstrated the effectiveness of voluntary cooperation and rule-based interaction. Baseball provided particularly compelling demonstrations of democratic principles through umpire systems that enforced rules impartially regardless of player status or team allegiance. German prisoners learned to accept unfavorable decisions from neutral authorities and to resolve disputes through established procedures rather than force or influence. Baseball umpires taught us respect for impartial authority, admitted Hauptmann George Weber in a post-war interview. German culture emphasized deference to superior rank and political connections, but baseball required acceptance of neutral rule enforcement that treated all players equally regardless of their background or affiliations. Weber's observation reflected broader German recognition that American success was based on institutional rather than personal factors. Rule of law, constitutional government, and independent judiciary systems provided foundations for prosperity and stability that were absent from German political traditions. The institutional education accelerated during the final months of the war as American officials began preparing prisoners for repatriation to a Germany that would be occupied and reconstructed according to American specifications. Re-education programs introduced German prisoners to democratic theory, free market economics, and constitutional government through courses that used American examples and case studies. At Camp Algona in Iowa, Dr. Margaret Willis taught a course on American business methods that used baseball team management as a practical example of democratic leadership and market economics. Students learned about budgeting, personnel management, and strategic planning through analysis of baseball operations that paralleled business administration principles. Baseball team management provided a non-threatening introduction to capitalist business methods. Dr. Willis explained in her academic paper on prisoner education. Students who might have rejected direct instruction in American economic theory welcomed the same concepts when presented through sports management examples. The business education included practical training in accounting, marketing, and financial planning that prepared prisoners for economic roles in post-war Germany. American officials understood that economic reconstruction would require German professionals with knowledge of market systems and democratic institutions. Prisoner education programs produced thousands of German graduates with American-style professional training who would serve as agents of democratization and economic modernization in occupied Germany. Many of these graduates maintained connections with American institutions and individuals that facilitated post-war cooperation and cultural exchange. Hans Wecker exemplified this pattern through his post-war immigration to the United States, where he completed medical school and established a successful practice in Georgetown, Maine. Wecker's American experience began with baseball instruction at Fort Robinson and culminated in permanent settlement that demonstrated the effectiveness of prisoner re-education programs. My American captivity was the most important educational experience of my life, Wecker reflected in a 98th birthday interview published in the Portland Press Herald. Baseball taught me democratic values, English language skills, and cultural appreciation that prepared me for American citizenship and professional success. Wecker's story represented thousands of similar cases where German prisoners chose American immigration over repatriation to war-devastated Germany. The immigration patterns provided evidence that prisoner programs had succeeded in creating German-American cultural bridges that served American strategic interests in post-war Europe. The strategic success was measured not only through individual immigration decisions but also through broader German adoption of American political, economic, and cultural methods during the occupation period. Former prisoners served as advocates for American approaches to education, business, and governance that facilitated German reconstruction along democratic lines. Colonel Patterson's final report to the War Department documented this strategic achievement through statistics that demonstrated prisoner program effectiveness. Of the 371,683 German prisoners repatriated between 1946 and 1948, 91% expressed positive attitudes toward American values and institutions. More significantly, 67% of former prisoners reported that their American experience had fundamentally changed their political and social perspectives. These prisoners became advocates for democracy, capitalism, and cultural exchange in a Germany that needed models for reconstruction and modernization. The baseball programs that had seemed like recreational frivolity to German officers proved to be effective instruments of cultural transformation that achieved strategic objectives while providing humanitarian treatment of enemy prisoners. The games that prisoners learned in American camps became symbols of democratic values and peaceful competition that contrasted sharply with Nazi ideology of conflict and domination. 50 years after the war's end, aging German prisoners gathered for reunions that celebrated their American experiences and the friendships that had survived decades of separation. These reunions provided evidence that prisoner programs had created lasting human connections that transcended national boundaries and former enmities. At a 1995 reunion in Omaha, Nebraska, 83 former prisoners from Fort Robinson gathered with American guards, civilian employers, and community members who had known them during the war. The reunion featured a baseball game between former prisoners and their children, demonstrating that American sports culture had been transmitted to the next generation of German families. Hans Wecker threw the ceremonial first pitch at age 88. His accuracy diminished, but his enthusiasm undiminished by 5 decades since his last prison camp game. Baseball taught me that former enemies could become friends through shared experiences and mutual respect, Wecker told the assembled crowd. This game represents everything positive about my American experience. The reunion baseball game served as a metaphor for broader post-war German-American relationships that had evolved from military conflict to political alliance and cultural partnership. The former prisoners who had learned democracy through baseball became advocates for NATO membership, European integration, and transatlantic cooperation that served American strategic interests throughout the Cold War. The long-term success of prisoner programs validated American decisions to treat German captives with generosity and respect rather than harsh punishment that might have created lasting resentment. The baseball diamonds carved from American soil by German hands became symbols of reconciliation and cooperation that demonstrated the power of cultural exchange to transform former enemies into permanent allies. Camp Hearne's baseball field survived into the 21st century as a memorial to the prisoner experience and a reminder that military victory could be accompanied by humanitarian treatment that served both strategic and moral purposes. Visitors to the restored camp could walk the same base paths that German prisoners had traversed while learning the complex rules of democracy through the simple pleasure of a game played with a stick and a ball. The field's preservation reflected American understanding that soft power exercised through cultural attraction could achieve more lasting results than hard power imposed through military force. The German prisoners who learned to love baseball became advocates for American values who contributed to decades of peaceful cooperation between former enemies. As the sun set over the restored baseball diamond at Camp Hearne, the silence held echoes of voices that had once cheered in German accents for American plays and celebrated victories that transcended national boundaries. The game that had taught German soldiers about democracy continued to serve as a symbol of the possibility that cultural understanding could triumph over political conflict. The story of German prisoners learning baseball in American camps represented more than historical curiosity. It demonstrated that even in wartime, nations could choose methods that appealed to human dignity rather than human suffering. The prisoners who discovered that America was another world became agents of transformation who helped build the peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Europe that emerged from the ruins of World War II. In the end, the baseball games played behind barbed wire achieved objectives that military victories alone could never accomplish. They created human connections that outlasted political conflicts, demonstrated values that inspired cultural change, and established foundations for cooperation that served both American interests and human progress. The German prisoners who watched baseball discovered not only a new game, but a new way of thinking about competition, cooperation, and the possibility of building better relationships between nations and peoples. The diamond-shaped fields where former enemies learned to play together became symbols of the hope that understanding could triumph over hatred, that shared humanity could overcome political differences, and that even the most bitter conflicts could end in friendship rather than eternal enmity. This was the true victory that American baseball achieved in the prison camps of World War II, not the defeat of Germany, but the conversion of Germans to partners in building a more peaceful world.